Throughout human history, great civilizations have always been shaped not only by visible forces such as the economy, wars, and natural resources, but also by invisible influences that operate in the shadows of power. While the eyes of the world are fixed on leaders and public figures, few notice the deeper spiritual currents that, according to ancient traditions, manipulate the destinies of nations. Among these ancient forces, one name echoes through the millennia in fearful whispers and forbidden texts: Belial, the spirit who bows to no master except his own insatiable lust for power and chaos. From ancient Hebrew texts to modern grimoires of ceremonial magic, Belial is described as an entity that operates precisely where human power reaches its apex. In the corridors of governments, in the boardrooms of global corporations, and in the exclusive circles of financial elites. Its subtle influence transcends political ideologies, economic systems, and even organized religions, forming an invisible web of corruption and domination that few can identify. But how could such an ancient spiritual entity continue to exert its influence over power structures in the modern world? And more importantly, how could we recognize and resist its presence in our own lives and institutions? The name Belial carries with it a deeply revealing meaning: masterless, worthless, or one who submits to no one. This etymology is not just a linguistic curiosity, but the key to understanding the essence of this entity that defies all authority and established order. In the ancient Semitic languages, particularly in Biblical Hebrew, the very construction of the name Belial suggests a fundamental negation of the cosmic hierarchy, a being that sets itself apart from the divine and natural order, creating its own realm where only chaos and individual will prevail. In the earliest mentions found in the Hebrew Bible, specifically in the book of Deuteronomy and the texts of Judges, the term sons of Belial was applied not to demons or supernatural entities, but to human beings of a deeply corrupt character. This initial association reveals something fundamental. Before being personified as a specific entity, Belial represented a behavioral archetype, a human tendency to reject collective morality and submit only to one's own desires. Wouldn't this be the first indication of how Belial operates? Not through spectacular possessions, but subtly through the moral flaws inherent in human nature? With the passing of the centuries and the evolution of Hebrew tradition, Belial gradually moved from a simple description of behavior to a personification of evil. In apocryphal texts such as the Book of Jubilees and the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly in the Damascus document, and the rule of the community found at Qumran, Belial emerges as the direct opponent of divine light. The Essene community, which produced these texts around the 2nd century BC, already saw Belial as the Prince of Darkness, the architect of the cosmic rebellion that seduced human beings into abandoning divine laws in favor of their own selfish desires. What makes the figure of Belial particularly terrifying is not only his power, but his ability to operate through apparent order. Unlike other spirits described in ancient texts who bring immediate destruction or visible chaos, Belial is often associated with the corruption of established systems. He doesn't destroy governments. He manipulates them from within. He doesn't abolish laws. He distorts them to serve the powerful. This characteristic became even more evident in the texts of the early Christian era, where Belial, sometimes called Belial in Greek traditions, was described as the spirit that infiltrates religious and political institutions, corrupting them while maintaining their appearance of legitimacy. The most disturbing aspect of Belial's nature, as described in texts from the Jewish Second Temple period, 516 BCE to 70 CE, is his ability to create convincing illusions of order and prosperity while sowing division and moral decay. It would be no exaggeration to say that Belial is the master of the sophisticated lie, the well-crafted deception that presents itself as incontrovertible truth. The Jewish apocalypse, known as the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, written around the 2nd century BCE, describes Belial as the spirit of darkness who offers 7 nets of deception through which he captures humanity, including false wisdom, false justice, and false prosperity. As we enter the medieval demonological tradition, Belial's reputation as a corrupter of social structures is further consolidated. The Testament of Solomon, a Judeo-Christian grimoire from the 1st century of the Common Era, presents a dialogue between King Solomon and various demons, including Belial, who describes himself as the one who was born first among the fallen angels and whose mission is to create false prophets and introduce crime among men. This characterization firmly establishes Belial not as a simple destroyer, but as an architect of systematic chaos, operating through the subtle manipulation of truth and social order. Particularly relevant to our understanding of how Belial influences power structures is the evolution of his image in Jewish and early Christian apocalyptic literature. The Apocalypse of Paul and the Ascension of Isaiah, apocryphal texts of early Christianity, describe Belial, or Belial, as the ruler of this world and the prince of false government. This characterization directly establishes the connection between this entity and human power structures, suggesting that wherever authority is exercised without compassion or true justice, Belial's influence is present. Isn't this vision a timeless warning about how concentrated power, without adequate moral restraints, inevitably becomes corrupted? Belial obeys no law, he is the law of the ego. This phrase, although modern in its formulation, perfectly captures the essence of this spirit as described in the ancient texts. The uncontrolled ego, the quest for power at any cost, the rejection of ethical boundaries in the name of individual will. These are all characteristics that the ancient texts associated with the sons of Belial, and which are still present in contemporary power structures. The difference is that today, we rarely recognize these tendencies as having a spiritual dimension. We prefer to analyze them exclusively through sociological or psychological lenses. What makes the study of Belial particularly relevant for our times is not only its historical association with the corruption of power, but the way in which this entity seems to operate precisely in the gaps and contradictions of human systems. When we examine the ancient descriptions of how Belial operates, through sophisticated lying, the manipulation of laws, the corruption of leaders, and the creation of social divisions, it is impossible not to recognize similar patterns in our own social and political structures. Could it be that, regardless of whether or not we believe in the literal existence of the spirit, the archetype it represents continues to shape our social and political reality? As we advance in our understanding of this enigmatic entity, we must consider an unsettling possibility. What if Belial's greatest victory is not overt corruption, but the gradual normalization of values that contradict our innate sense of justice and community? What if his real triumph is to make us accept, little by little, a world where unrestricted ego is celebrated, where the acquisition of power and wealth justifies any means, and where truth becomes just another commodity to be manipulated by the powerful? These are questions that transcend mere curiosity about ancient texts and invite us to critically examine the spiritual and moral foundations of the societies we live in today. In the medieval demonological tradition, especially in the famous grimoires that began to circulate between the 13th and 18th centuries, Belial rose to a position of extraordinary hierarchical power. The Lemegeton Clavicula Salomonis, better known as the Goetia or Ars Goetia, clearly identifies him as one of the four great infernal kings, ruling the northern region of the abyss together with Amamum, Satanachia, and Astaroth. This elevation of status was not accidental. It reflected the growing perception of Belial as an entity directly associated with earthly power structures and the manipulation of human affairs on a grand scale, differentiating him from lesser demons, more limited in their influence. Unlike other spirits described in the grimoires who have bizarre or monstrous appearances, Belial is often depicted as an angelic figure of extraordinary beauty, speaking with a sweet and pleasant voice. Johann Weyer's Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, published in 1577, describes him as appearing in the form of a beautiful angel sitting in a chariot of fire, speaking with grace and promising favors to those who invoke him. This description is no mere aesthetic curiosity. It reveals something fundamental about Belial's nature. His power lies precisely in his ability to present evil in the guise of good, to make the corrupt appear desirable and the destructive appear constructive. Is it any coincidence that the greatest manipulators of human power also tend to present themselves in an impeccable and seductive manner? A cult tradition attributes to Belial the command of 80 demonic legions, a number that suggests massive military power in the spiritual realm. Each of these legions, according to texts such as Colin de Planzy's Dictionnaire Infernal, 1818, is made up of demons who specialize in different aspects of human corruption. Some influence judges to make unjust decisions, others inspire legislators to create laws that benefit only the powerful, still others specialize in corrupting religious leaders and turning them into hypocrites. This hierarchical structure eerily mirrors human bureaucracies, suggesting that Belial not only influences systems of power, but that perhaps complex bureaucratic systems themselves are, on some archetypal level, reflections of his influence on the collective psyche. The most disturbing aspect of Belial in occult literature is his particular specialty, granting social position, political influence, and material wealth in exchange for the summoner's spiritual essence. Grimoires describe how those who make pacts with him quickly rise to positions of temporal power, often in ways that are inexplicable to outside observers. The Liber Officiorum Spirituum, a 16th century manuscript, states that Belial causes men of no merit to be received by great lords and elevated to honors, highlighting his ability to subvert meritocratic systems. Could this not be a possible esoteric explanation for the common phenomenon of apparently unprepared or morally corrupt individuals reaching positions of extreme power and influence in various societies throughout history? Particularly in Renaissance occultism, the method of invoking Belial involved elaborate rituals with symbolism that reveals much about his nature. The rituals required specific offerings: red wine poured over black earth, symbolizing blood and power over the physical earth, gold or silver coins, representing material ambition, and the performance of the ritual during the planetary hour of Jupiter, the planet traditionally associated with rulers, judges, and the expansion of power. These ritual correspondences were not arbitrary, but reflected the medieval magician's understanding of the spirit's areas of influence: government, the economy, and human power structures in general. Magical literature also describes the signs of Belial's presence that occur when this spirit influences an environment: an inexplicable increase in conflicts and divisions between previously united people, the gradual erosion of moral principles in the name of pragmatism, the rise of charismatic but morally empty figures to positions of influence, and the establishment of rigid hierarchies where horizontal cooperation previously existed. The famous 20th century English occultist Aleister Crowley, without directly mentioning Belial, describes similar phenomena in his observations on how certain spiritual currents influence human organizations, gradually transforming them into power structures where every man and woman is a star, is replaced by systems of domination and submission. An aspect often overlooked in studies of Belial is his association with the dissemination of forbidden knowledge, but in a distorted form. The grimoire known as the True Black Book of Solomon suggests that Belial is the spirit who reveals secrets and hidden knowledge, not to enlighten, but to corrupt. This text describes how he offers partial secrets, incomplete or decontextualized truths that, although technically correct, lead to false conclusions when applied. Isn't this an esoteric parallel to contemporary phenomena such as strategic disinformation and the manipulation of data to create misleading narratives? The difference is that, in the occult view, this manipulation of the truth is not just a power technique, but a specific spiritual influence with cosmic intentions. In more modern approaches to ceremonial magic, particularly in the schools of chaos magic that emerged at the end of the 20th century, Belial is often reinterpreted not as a literal entity, but as an archetypal principle operating in the collective psyche of humanity. Contemporary magicians such as Peter Carroll and Phil Hine suggest that entities like Belial can be understood as collective thought forms, or egregores, that have gained independence and power due to concentrated human attention over millennia. This perspective raises a fascinating question. If Belial is indeed a creation of the human collective psyche, aren't our own power structures and economic systems material manifestations of this thought form, continually fed by our tacit acceptance of its values? The visual descriptions of Belial in traditional grimoires are loaded with symbolism relevant to his function as a manipulator of power. He is often depicted holding a scepter, a symbol of governmental authority, wearing purple clothing, the color traditionally reserved for emperors and high priests, and accompanied by two great kings as ministers. These iconographic representations were not merely decorative, but visually encoded the occult understanding of how Belial operates, not as an external destroyer, but as an internal manipulator of the very structures of legitimate authority. The fact that he is accompanied by two kings suggests that he does not eliminate existing authority, but puts it at his service, maintaining external appearances while fundamentally altering the purpose of institutions. At the intersection of traditional demonology and modern esoteric currents, an understanding of Belial has emerged as the ruler of the interval, the spirit who dominates the spaces between systems, the gray areas where the rules are not clearly defined. This characterization is particularly significant in our contemporary world, where power often operates precisely in these interstices, between national jurisdictions, between the legal and the illegal, between the ethical and the unethical. Contemporary occult theorists such as Thomas Carlson of the Red Dragon Lodge suggest that Belial doesn't need to openly violate laws or systems. He simply exploits their inherent contradictions and ambiguities, transforming them from the inside out without ever appearing to have broken their formal structures. Isn't this a perfectly applicable description of the way corporate and political power often operates in the contemporary globalized world? Belial's influence on human power structures operates in a fundamentally different way to the popular conception of demonic interference. Contrary to the Hollywood notion of direct possession of individuals, the esoteric tradition describes Belial as a force that operates primarily at the level of collective systems and structures. This entity does not simply seek to control individual bodies, too small an ambition for a hellish king, but rather to influence the very paradigms through which power is exercised and legitimized in human societies. Medieval manuscripts such as the Grimorium Verum suggest that while lesser demons may be content with tormenting individuals, Belial seeks to torment entire civilizations through the systematic corruption of their fundamental institutions. Contemporary observers often question how a spiritual entity could influence seemingly secular systems such as modern governments, multinational corporations, or global financial institutions. The answer, according to esoteric scholars such as Manly P. Hall and René Guénon, lies in the realization that all human systems, however material they may seem, are fundamentally collective mental structures, aggregates of shared beliefs, values, and paradigms. And it is precisely at this mental/spiritual level that Belial exerts its most profound influence. Isn't the paradigm of infinite growth on a finite planet, for example, a contemporary manifestation of Belialian influence, a collective belief that, although obviously unsustainable, continues to guide global economic decisions with potentially catastrophic consequences? The traditional description of Belial as the spirit that possesses no bodies, but influences systems, finds surprising parallels in modern social theories about how power operates in bureaucratic structures. Sociologist Max Weber described the iron cage of modern bureaucratic rationality. Systems that, once established, seem to take on a life of their own and operate according to internal logics that often contradict the very human values they are supposed to serve. This sociological observation eerily echoes esoteric descriptions of how Belial operates, creating systems that, although apparently rational and orderly, gradually subvert higher human purposes and become self-perpetuating mechanisms of domination. Could it be that Weber identified in secular terms a phenomenon that older spiritual traditions understood in esoteric language? One of the most disturbing aspects of the Belialian influence on power structures is its manifestation through what the Hermetic texts call the inversion of values. This phenomenon occurs when systems originally created to serve the common good are gradually reoriented to serve particular interests, while retaining the rhetoric and outward appearance of public service. Historical examples abound. Religious institutions that become primarily concerned with the accumulation of wealth and political power, judicial systems that become instruments of oppression of the less privileged classes, or regulatory agencies that end up captured by the very interests they were supposed to regulate. In each case, the external structure and official language remain geared towards the common good, while the actual operation of the system serves diametrically opposed purposes. Isn't this the classic signature of Belialian influence as described in ancient demonological treatises? Where there is absolute power, Belial reigns in silence. This phrase captures a fundamental esoteric understanding. The influence of this spirit manifests itself most powerfully precisely where human power is concentrated without adequate counterweights. The Kabbalistic tradition, particularly in the writings of Isaac Luria, describes how the breaking of the vessels, the inability of created structures to contain divine light, results in fragmentation and imbalance. When applied to human power structures, this metaphor suggests that any excessive concentration of authority inevitably creates the perfect conditions for bellicose influence to flourish. It is not through the destruction of power, but through its unbalanced concentration, that Belial finds his way to the center of human systems. Could this be the reason why we almost invariably observe that the more absolute the power, the more complete the accompanying moral corruption? The Belialian manipulation of power operates through three fundamental principles identified in medieval Hermetic texts: pride, greed, and the desire for control. These are not just individual moral defects, but spiritual forces that, when amplified by the structure of complex systems, become operating principles that shape entire civilizations. Pride manifests itself institutionally as the belief in exceptionality, the notion that a certain group, nation, or class is above the moral limitations that apply to others. Institutionalized greed appears as the systematic prioritization of growth and accumulation above all other considerations. And the desire for control manifests itself as the continuous expansion of surveillance and compliance systems that seek to eliminate all human unpredictability. Aren't these three principles precisely the undeclared fundamental values that guide much of contemporary global governance? An often overlooked aspect of Belialian influence is its manifest preference for operating through apparently neutral legal and bureaucratic systems. Texts from the European Hermetic tradition, particularly those associated with the 14th century Avignon school, describe how this spirit corrupts first the letter of the law, then its interpretation, and finally its purpose, while keeping its outward form intact. This esoteric medieval description finds disturbing parallels in the observations of contemporary critical theorists about how legal and bureaucratic systems, although apparently impartial, often codify and institutionalize deep structural inequalities. The difference is that, in the esoteric view, this is not just a sociological dynamic, but the result of a specific spiritual influence that deliberately seeks to transform instruments of justice into tools of domination. The esoteric traditions of the Middle East, particularly Sufi texts such as Shirawardi's Book of Illuminations, offer a complementary perspective on how Belial operates behind the scenes of power. These texts describe a spiritual phenomenon called the Golden Veil, an influence that doesn't completely obscure the truth, as a black veil would, but distorts it in a subtle way, causing those under its influence to perceive only partial aspects of reality that serve certain interests. This esoteric metaphor seems to describe with disturbing accuracy how contemporary information and media systems work, which, without necessarily lying explicitly, create partial realities through the strategic selection, framing, and contextualization of facts. Isn't this subtle manipulation of collective perception a contemporary manifestation of Belialian influence as understood in esoteric traditions? A disturbing element in the esoteric understanding of Belial is its association with what the Hermeticists called false light, intellectual enlightenment disconnected from higher moral principles. Alchemical manuscripts such as the Splendor Solis warn against the danger of seeking knowledge and power without corresponding ethical development, describing how such a quest inevitably attracts the influence of Belial. This esoteric understanding seems strangely prophetic when we consider how contemporary technological and scientific development, disconnected from a corresponding ethical evolution, has created unprecedented tools of power that now threaten the very existence of human civilization. Could it be that our current civilizational crisis, where we possess the technical knowledge to transform the entire planet but apparently lack the moral wisdom to use it responsibly, is a global manifestation of the Belialian influence as understood by the ancient esoteric texts? The esoteric traditions of Tibet offer a particularly revealing perspective on how to resist Belial's influence on power structures. The Dzogchen texts describe similar entities as illusory obstacles, which, although they appear to have independent existence and immense power, are fundamentally empty of their own essence, manifestations of the human collective mind that gain power only through our own attention and belief. This understanding suggests that the real resistance to Belialian influence lies not in fighting it directly, which only strengthens its apparent reality, but in consciously cultivating alternative values and systems based on principles diametrically opposed to its own. Wouldn't this esoteric wisdom be valuable guidance for contemporary movements that seek to transform power structures without reproducing the same dynamics of domination they are fighting against? The traditional esoteric understanding of Belial culminates in a profound observation. This spirit does not create anything new, but distorts and inverts what already exists. It has no creative power of its own, only the ability to corrupt what others have created with positive intentions. This fundamental limitation offers not only an understanding of how bellicose influence operates, but also points to its essential vulnerability. Systems built primarily on warmongering values, selfishness, greed, and control carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, as they lack the creativity and genuine vitality that only constructive principles can sustain in the long term. Perhaps this is why, throughout history, even the most powerful and seemingly unshakable empires eventually collapse when they become primary vehicles of bellicose expression. Wouldn't this esoteric understanding be a source of realistic hope for those who observe with concern the current state of global power structures? Pacts with Belial, as described in medieval and Renaissance grimoires, are fundamentally distinguished from agreements with other entities by the specific nature of the proposed exchanges. While pacts with lesser spirits typically involve limited personal benefits, agreements with Belial, detailed in texts such as the Grand Grimoire and the Grimorium Verum, specifically offer influence over collective power structures. The ritualist does not ask for direct wealth, but the keys to the treasure chambers. He does not ask for personal love, but the power to bend alien wills to his purposes. He does not seek knowledge for its own sake, but secrets that can be used to control others. This distinction reveals something fundamental about the nature of Belialian pacts. They are not merely intended to benefit the individual, but to turn him or her into a vehicle for the expansion of this entity's influence over wider human collectivities. Traditional esoteric literature is unanimous on one particularly disturbing point. The price of the pact with Belial transcends the merely personal or spiritual dimension. As the obscure 16th century Venetian manuscript De Pactis cum Demonibus, On Pacts with Demons, explains, he who allies himself with Belial not only compromises his own soul, but becomes a verum instrumentum destructionis collectivi, a true instrument of collective destruction. The text elaborates that the true cost of the pact is to become a channel through which Belial's influence can affect not only the individual, but communities, institutions, and even entire civilizations. Isn't this medieval description strangely prophetic when we observe how certain individuals in positions of power seem willing to sacrifice collective well-being in exchange for personal benefits, effectively becoming instruments of social and environmental degradation on a global scale? The rituals associated with the invocation of Belial, as preserved in European occult traditions, reveal disturbing parallels with certain practices observable in contemporary elitist circles. Texts such as the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Magician describe ceremonies that require specific elements, underground or isolated spaces, the exclusive presence of already initiated individuals, the use of masks or face coverings to preserve identity during contact, performance during specific periods when the veil between worlds is thinnest, particularly solstices and equinoxes, and most significantly, the presence of silent witnesses, individuals who observe but do not participate directly, creating a system of complicity and mutual control. Could it be a coincidence that gatherings of certain global elitist organizations often incorporate similar ritual elements? Isolated locations, exclusive access, certain times of the year, and structures that create interdependence and mutual control between participants? The esoteric tradition about Belial repeatedly emphasizes a little understood aspect of his pacts: the gradual transfer of identity. Manuscripts such as Francesco Maria Guazzo's Compendium Maleficarum, 1608, warn that, unlike other demons who offer benefits without necessarily altering the essence of the one who invokes them, Belial operates through a transformatio subtilis, a subtle transformation of the invoker's own identity. The text describes how, over time, those who maintain Belialian pacts begin to perceive reality exclusively through the lens of the values associated with this entity: domination, hierarchy, control, and fragmentation. This psycho-spiritual transformation is so complete that eventually the invoker no longer distinguishes between their own desires and the Belialian objectives, perceiving themselves as completely autonomous while serving as a perfect vehicle for this spiritual influence. Wouldn't this medieval description be surprisingly congruent with contemporary psychological observations about how prolonged and unchecked power fundamentally transforms the moral cognition of individuals in positions of authority? Symbols traditionally associated with Belialian cults include elements that have reappeared in intriguing ways in contemporary power iconography. The all-seeing eye, for example, was not originally a benevolent Masonic symbol as is often assumed, but appears in earlier occult manuscripts as the oculus Belial, the eye of Belial that represents total surveillance as an instrument of domination. Similarly, the empty throne, a seat of power surrounded by symbols of authority but with no visible occupant, appears in grimoires as a visual representation of how Belial operates, not directly occupying positions of authority, but invisibly influencing through them. And mask rituals, present in ancient manuscripts about the Ordo Templi Belial, not only serve to conceal identities, but symbolize the replacement of individual identity with a ritual persona, a practice that finds disturbing echoes in modern elite rituals where masks often play a central role. Are these similarities mere coincidences, or do they suggest the persistence of Belialian influences in contemporary elitist iconography and practices? The historical connections between Belialian cults and secret societies linked to power structures are more substantial than generally recognized in mainstream discourse. Documents from the archives of the Venetian Inquisition, particularly the records of the trial of the Fratellanza della Chiave Nera, Fraternity of the Black Key, in 1579, reveal how certain aristocratic groups practiced explicitly Belialian rituals with a specific aim of maintaining and expanding political influence. Similarly, the papers seized from the British Hellfire Club in the 18th century, although often dismissed as merely the libertine amusements of the elite, included ritual elements clearly derived from Belialian traditions, particularly the deliberate inversion of conventional moral values as a technique of liberation of conscience for the manipulation of power. These historical connections raise disturbing questions. To what extent might similar ritual traditions have persisted in contemporary elitist circles, perhaps with modernized symbolism but preserving similar functional essences? Research into contemporary Belialian cults is complicated not only by the natural secrecy of such groups, but by mainstream culture's tendency to automatically dismiss such investigations as conspiracy theories, regardless of the evidence presented. However, consistent accounts emerge from ex-participants of elitist circles about ritual practices which, although rarely explicitly termed Belialian, incorporate elements clearly derived from these traditions. Particularly disturbing are the consistent testimonies about rituals involving elements of investiture and divestiture of conscience, practices described in ancient Belialian texts as techniques for temporarily separating ordinary moral conscience, allowing participants to perform actions they would normally consider unacceptable, effectively creating psychological compartmentalization that facilitates participation in abusive systems while maintaining a positive self-image. Isn't this kind of functional dissociation precisely the psychological mechanism needed to participate in systems of power that systematically harm the collective good while benefiting narrow elites? One ritualistic element often associated with Belian traditions that finds disturbing parallels in contemporary elitist practices is the concept of inverted hierophany, the revelation of the sacred through its deliberate desecration. This practice, detailed in manuscripts such as the ritual of the inversion of the temple from the library of Alessandro Cagliostro, involves the deliberate desacralization of symbols and values considered sacred by wider society, not merely as rebellion, but as an initiatory technique to free the consciousness of participants from conventional moral limitations. The stated aim of such rituals is not simply to shock or transgress, but to create an operational freedom to manipulate systems based on values that the manipulators themselves no longer share. Could it be that certain transgressive practices documented in contemporary elitist gatherings serve a similar function, not merely as hedonistic indulgences, but as functional techniques to facilitate a moral operation within systems of power? The most revealing aspect of traditional Belialian cults, and potentially their contemporary counterparts, is not the pursuit of explicit evil as often caricatured, but the elevation of efficacy as the supreme value above all other considerations. Manuscripts such as the Codex of the Black Key, found in Aleister Crowley's occult library, describe how true Belialian initiates do not abandon moral principles out of simple defiance, but subconsciously reorganize their value structure so that the ability to accomplish goals, pure effectiveness, becomes the sole criterion for determining appropriate actions. This shift in values creates what the manuscript calls technical consciousness, a mentality that evaluates all situations exclusively in terms of effective manipulation towards predetermined goals, without regard for broader moral implications. Isn't this consecration of efficiency as the supreme value precisely the defining characteristic of the contemporary technocratic systems that increasingly dominate global governance? The most disturbing dimension of bellicose pacts, as described in traditional esoteric texts, is the creation of what medieval manuscripts call vinculum invisibilis, the invisible bond. Texts such as Giordano Bruno's De Vinculis Ingenieur describe how these spiritual connections create psychic dependencies that transcend the individual life of the pactant, being transferred through family and institutional lineages. This esoteric understanding finds disturbing parallels in contemporary sociological observations about how certain families and institutions seem to maintain remarkable consistency in values and practices across multiple generations, as if linked to currents of influence that transcend specific individuals. The traditional esoteric perspective would offer a complementary explanation for such observations. Not only are socialization and structural advantages transmitted, but also specific spiritual connections that influence fundamental psychic orientations towards power and its exercise. A particularly significant element of Belialian rituals, both historical and possibly contemporary, is the concept of mutual testimony as a control mechanism. Documents from the 17th century Societas Luciferi describe elaborate rituals where participants not only witness each other's transgressive acts, but actively participate in them, creating what the manuscript describes as ritus obligationis mutui, a network of mutual obligation that makes it impossible for any member to denounce the group without implicating. Belial's presence in contemporary pop culture is significantly more widespread than many casual observers realize, manifesting itself not as an explicit representation of a horned, trident-wielding demon, a cartoonish image that mainly serves to trivialize the concept, but through specific narrative archetypes and symbolic patterns that precisely reflect the qualities attributed to this entity in esoteric traditions. Particularly in cinema, the figure of the elegant manipulator who operates behind the scenes of power emerges repeatedly. Characters like Gordon Gekko in Wall Street, Daniel Plainview in Black Blood, or more recently Logan Roy in Succession, embody the Belialian archetype with remarkable precision, figures who do not seek explicit destruction, but the subversion of fundamental human values in the name of power and systematic domination, often presented with a deliberate moral ambiguity that seduces the viewer into secretly admiring their transgressions. A particularly revealing pattern in the representation of Belialian figures in pop culture is the recurring narrative of the corporate Faustian pact, stories where protagonists sacrifice fundamental human values in exchange for institutional success. Films such as The Devil Wears Prada, The Social Network, or The Wolf of Wall Street follow remarkably consistent narrative structures that precisely reflect the nature of Belialian pacts as described in esoteric texts. Protagonists don't explicitly sell their souls, but gradually abandon genuine human connections, empathy, and ethical values as they ascend within systems of power, eventually becoming unrecognizable to their former selves. What makes these narratives particularly significant from an esoteric point of view is that, despite their nominally critical conclusions, they often function as vicarious initiations for audiences, subtly normalizing the notion that success in the real world necessarily requires the abandonment of fundamental moral principles. Isn't this gradual normalization of Belialian values precisely one of the mechanisms through which their influence expands culturally? Symbols traditionally associated with Belial appear with surprising frequency in contemporary corporate and entertainment contexts, often recontextualized in ways that obscure their esoteric origins while preserving their archetypal functions. The single eye, or all-seeing eye, for example, historically associated with Belial in demonological treatises as a symbol of surveillance and hierarchy, has become ubiquitous in corporate logos, virtual reality designs, and surveillance aesthetics, always associated with notions of superior vision or privileged knowledge. Similarly, the representation of the empty throne, another traditional Belialian symbol representing invisible authority, consistently reappears in corporate marketing and government communications, suggesting power that transcends individual figures. This persistence of specific symbols raises fascinating questions. Are these correspondences merely aesthetic coincidences, or do they reflect the continuity of archetypal currents that operate independently of the explicit awareness of their contemporary creators? The music industry offers particularly obvious examples of Belialian influence in contemporary culture, not only through deliberate esoteric references by specific artists, but through the normalization of fundamentally Belialian values. The glorification of material wealth as the only meaningful indicator of personal worth, the celebration of the manipulation of others as an admirable skill, the exaltation of the individual ego as the supreme authority above any collective consideration. These recurring themes in multiple musical genres reflect precisely the values attributed to Belial in esoteric traditions. Particularly significant is the tendency of certain mainstream artists to deliberately incorporate occult symbolism traditionally associated with Belial, such as hierarchical inversions, obelisks, specific ritual costumes, and gestures corresponding to invocations in the ceremonial tradition, while simultaneously denying any esoteric knowledge or intent, creating what occult scholars such as Manly P. Hall would call an unconscious initiation of the audience into specific currents of archetypal influence. The representation of authority figures in pop culture reveals a consistent pattern that disturbingly reflects Belialian influence. The almost universal characterization of political leaders, CEOs, and institutional authority figures as fundamentally corrupt or corruptible. This systematic representation, visible in films, series, soap operas, and even cartoons, not only reflects observable realities of institutional corruption, but potentially reinforces and normalizes the perception that such corruption is inevitable and universal. Media historians and social psychologists have documented how this dominant narrative gradually erodes belief in the possibility of ethical governance, creating a feedback loop where increasingly disengaged citizens enable precisely the conditions that facilitate greater institutional corruption. Wouldn't this cultural dynamic precisely mirror the goal attributed to Belial in esoteric texts, to undermine belief in the possibility of legitimate authority by turning every power structure into a potential vehicle for his influence? An often overlooked aspect of Belial's presence in pop culture is the progressive glamorization of the archetype of the corrupt tycoon or manipulative politician as an aspirational figure. Analyzing the evolution of cultural representations over the last few decades, a disturbing trend can be observed. Characters who would have been clear antagonists in previous narratives, such as Gordon Gekko in Wall Street, gradually became ambiguous anti-heroes and finally aspirational protagonists. Contemporary series such as House of Cards, Billions, or Succession exemplify this trend, presenting protagonists who embody fundamentally bellicose values, manipulation, hierarchical domination, and the abandonment of ethical principles in the name of efficiency, as complex characters whose ruthlessness is subtly coded as admirable strength. Wouldn't this cultural transformation indicate a significant shift in collective values towards the normalization of precisely bellicose characteristics? Particularly revealing is pop culture's persistent tendency to portray the tension between ethical values and institutional success as a zero-sum game, where moral principles are inevitably presented as naive obstacles to success in the real world. This false dichotomy, present in countless films, series, and personal development books, reflects precisely the Belialian distortion described in esoteric texts, the inversion that turns virtues into weaknesses and vices into admirable pragmatism. The persistence of this cultural narrative, which contradicts empirical evidence on the practical benefits of ethical leadership and sustainable business, suggests an influence that transcends simply reflecting existing realities, but actively shapes collective perceptions in specific directions. As philosopher Mark Fisher observed, it has become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, a limitation of the collective imagination that esoteric texts would attribute precisely to the Belial influence, which thrives when ethical alternatives to existing systems seem literally unimaginable. The appropriation and commercialization of symbolism, originally associated with anti-Belial resistance, represents another subtle mechanism through which this influence manifests itself in contemporary culture. Symbols that historically represented opposition to materialistic values and oppressive hierarchies, from the peace symbol and images of revolutionaries to concepts such as mindfulness and sustainability, are systematically incorporated into corporate marketing, emptied of their original transformative content and converted into mere aesthetic signifiers or tools for increasing productivity within fundamentally unchanged systems. This process, which philosopher Herbert Marcuse called repressive desublimation, precisely mirrors the tactic attributed to Belial in esoteric texts, the neutralization of potential opposition not through direct repression, but through absorption and recontextualization that preserves appearances while inverting fundamental essences. Isn't this ability to co-opt even symbols of resistance the contemporary manifestation of what ancient traditions described as Belial's ability to turn light into shadow while making it appear even brighter? The visual aesthetic associated with contemporary centers of power, from government and corporate buildings to stock exchanges and central banks, incorporates with remarkable consistency architectural and symbolic elements traditionally associated with Belial in esoteric literature. The predominance of obelisks and pyramidal structures, the hierarchical separation of spaces, the use of materials such as black granite and reflective surfaces, the incorporation of high vision symbols such as stylized eyes and eagles, the deliberate imposition of scale to induce feelings of individual insignificance. All these elements precisely reflect the architectural correspondences attributed to Belial in manuscripts such as Athanasius Kircher's 17th century Architectura de Minorum. This aesthetic consistency transcends apparently opposing cultures and political systems, suggesting the expression of an archetypal principle that operates independently of superficial ideologies. Is this symbolic consistency merely an aesthetic coincidence, or the visual manifestation of an archetypal influence operating across multiple, apparently distinct human systems? The most telling indicator of Belialian influence in contemporary pop culture is not any specific symbol or narrative, but the gradual normalization of the dissociation between personal success and collective responsibility. From the glorification of disruption, without regard for wider social impacts, to the celebration of life hacks that essentially involve exploiting loopholes in social systems, contemporary culture progressively redefines cleverness as the ability to prioritize personal advantage over collective well-being. This cultural redefinition reflects precisely the essence of Belial influence as described in esoteric texts, the gradual replacement of values based on reciprocity and mutual responsibility with a paradigm where maximizing individual advantage becomes the only meaningful moral criterion. What makes this cultural transformation particularly significant is that it occurs not through an explicit repudiation of traditional morality, but through its gradual resignification until concepts such as success, achievement, and freedom become completely dissociated from their original collective contexts. Precisely the process that esoteric texts attribute to Belialian influence. Not the direct destruction of values, but their subtle inversion while preserving familiar terminologies. Careful analysis of the evolution of pop culture reveals a disturbing pattern that corresponds precisely to what esoteric traditions would describe as the Belialian strategy of gradual inversion. The systematic transformation of elements previously considered dystopian into normalized aspirational characteristics. Behaviors and systems that work, such as 1984, Brave New World, or Blade Runner, presented as terrifying warnings, constant surveillance, chemical modification of emotions, fusion between corporations and governments, identities determined by commercial brands, have progressively become normalized or even desirable characteristics in contemporary culture. This reversal has not occurred through direct imposition, but through the gradual cultural resignification that has transformed dystopia into inevitable innovation. Isn't this systematic cultural transformation precisely what ancient esoteric traditions would describe as the manifestation of Belialian influence? The ability to invert fundamental values while preserving familiar terminology, until imprisonment looks like freedom and submission looks like power? To understand how to effectively resist the Belial influence in our lives and institutions, we must first recognize its dual nature. Belial is not only an external force operating through systems and structures, but also an internal tendency present in the human psyche. This duality is consistently emphasized in the deeper esoteric texts, particularly in the manuscripts of the Kabbalistic tradition such as the Sefer HaBahir and the Zohar, which describe Belial as both a cosmic entity and a potential quality of the human soul, the tendency to absolutize the individual ego, subordinate collective considerations to personal advantage, and gradually dissociate technical efficacy from ethical responsibility. This dual understanding suggests that true resistance must occur simultaneously on two complementary levels, through transformations of individual consciousness and reformulations of the collective systems that structure our social interactions. The European Hermetic tradition, particularly in the alchemical texts that survived medieval persecution, offers profound insights into how to internally resist Belialian influence. The process that the alchemists called separatio, the ability to discern between different spiritual qualities operating through us, represents the first crucial step in this resistance. Manuscripts such as the Aurora Consurgens describe specific techniques for developing what they called double vision, the ability to simultaneously observe our external actions and the internal motivations that drive them. This practice of non-judgmental self-observation allows us to identify specific moments where bellicose values, maximizing personal advantage, manipulating others, seeking control, etc., infiltrate our decision-making process, often disguised as pragmatism or realism. Isn't this capacity for internal discernment precisely what is lacking in many contemporary approaches to personal development, which often teach efficiency techniques without the corresponding development of ethical sensitivity? In Eastern contemplative traditions, particularly Vajrayana Buddhism and esoteric Taoism, we find sophisticated methodologies for transforming energies associated with Belial, or their equivalents in different cultural systems, without succumbing to the Western tendency to repress or deny them, approaches that often strengthen their subliminal influence. Texts such as the Tibetan Bardo Thodol describe how qualities such as ambition, pride, and the desire to dominate should not be denied, but consciously recognized and transformed through practices that redirect their essential energy towards constructive purposes. This approach of transmutation, rather than repression, offers a sophisticated model for confronting inner bellicose tendencies without falling into the dual trap of rigid moralism, which often masks the same tendencies in reverse, or a moral permissiveness that simply gives in to them. Wouldn't this approach of conscious transformation be a necessary alternative to both the repressive Puritanism and self-centered libertarianism that dominate contemporary moral discourse? Contemporary research in social psychology and neuroscience offers fascinating evidence that validates traditional practices of resistance to bellicose influence through the deliberate cultivation of specific mental states. Studies on the effects of contemplative practices demonstrate how meditations focused on compassion and interdependence produce measurable changes in the activity of brain regions associated with competitive and hierarchical behaviors. Particularly significant is the finding that regular practices of loving kindness, metta in Buddhism, not only increase prosocial behaviors, but specifically reduce implicit biases associated with social hierarchies. Precisely the kind of mental structures that esoteric traditions would associate with Belialian influence. These findings suggest a remarkable convergence between traditional spiritual practices and contemporary science, both of which point to the possibility of cultivating mental states that naturally resist the values of domination, rigid hierarchy, and maximization of individual advantage that characterize bellicose influence. At the level of collective systems, effective resistance to Belialian influence requires the deliberate development of structures that embody principles diametrically opposed to those associated with this entity in esoteric texts. Where Belial operates through rigid hierarchies, effective resistance involves the development of horizontal decision-making structures, as demonstrated by successful cooperatives and organizations based on distributed governance. Where Belialian influence promotes opacity and informational manipulation, structures of effective resistance incorporate radical transparency and equitable access to information. Where Belial thrives through the concentration of power without accountability, resistant systems develop sophisticated accountability mechanisms and mandate limitations. These are not merely technical reforms, but fundamental reorientations of the organizing principles that structure human interactions, deliberately aligned with values opposed to those that esoteric traditions identify as Belialian. An often overlooked aspect of resistance to Belialian influence is the deliberate reconstruction of cultural narratives that determine our horizons of imaginative possibility. As the cultural theorist Frederick Jameson observed, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, a limitation of collective imagination that esoteric texts would attribute precisely to Belialian influence, which thrives when alternatives to dominant systems seem literally unimaginable. To effectively resist, therefore, involves what philosophers like Jacques Rancière call the redistribution of the sensible, the creation of new languages, images, and narratives that make conceivable modes of human organization based on non-Belian principles. This cultural work is not secondary to the transformation of systems, but a necessary prerequisite, because we cannot collectively create what we cannot even imagine. Isn't this deliberate reconstruction of the imaginative horizon precisely what is lacking in many contemporary movements that seek social transformation but remain trapped in languages and conceptual structures that inadvertently reproduce Belialian values? The true spiritual freedom that allows us to resist bellicose influence arises precisely when we transcend the psychological need to sell out, when we develop what existentialist philosophers called authenticity and spiritual traditions call inner integrity. This quality involves the ability to remain faithful to fundamental values, even when this implies immediate material or social disadvantages. Esoteric texts are unanimous on one crucial point. The primary force that makes Belialian influence possible is not greed or raw materialism, but the existential fear that drives us to seek security through conformity and accumulation. As the Sufi tradition's Book of Unveiling explains, "He who fears death more than he loves truth has already sold his soul, even if no contract has been signed." This observation suggests that the most fundamental resistance occurs not through specific external actions, but through the inner transformation that frees us from fear as a primary motivator, allowing decisions based on ethical discernment even when they imply personal costs. The spiritual traditions of various cultures converge on a profound observation about the nature of resistance to bellicose influence. It cannot be effective if it is motivated primarily by opposition, anger, or fear, because these emotions inevitably reproduce the very qualities they seek to combat. As the Buddhist Dhammapada explains, hatred never ceases through hatred, but only through love, a principle that is not mere sentimentality, but deep psychological observation about how emotional patterns perpetuate themselves. Esoteric texts such as the Corpus Hermeticum elaborate that true resistance to influences such as Belial's must be driven not by reactive opposition, but by positive alignment with diametrically opposed principles. Where Belial promotes hierarchy, deliberately cultivate horizontality. Where he promotes secrecy, practice transparency. Where he promotes accumulation, cultivate generosity. This propositional, rather than merely oppositional approach avoids the common trap of resistance movements gradually turning into what they originally intended to fight. A particularly profound esoteric understanding of effective resistance comes from the Kabbalistic tradition, specifically the concept of tikkun olam, the repair or healing of the world. This tradition teaches that the influence of forces like Belial cannot simply be eliminated or suppressed, but must be consciously and deliberately reintegrated into a more harmonious order. The Zohar describes how the real spiritual work is not to destroy the other side, Sitra Akra, but to recontextualize it within a more balanced totality where its energy can serve constructive purposes. This sophisticated approach transcends the simplistic dualistic view of fighting evil in favor of a deeper understanding. Qualities such as ambition, assertiveness, and the desire for excellence, which under bellicose influence become distorted into greed, domination, and hierarchical superiority, need not be eliminated, but reintegrated into a value structure where they serve collective flourishing rather than individualistic domination. The historical experience of movements that have effectively resisted the bellicose influence on social structures reveals a consistent pattern. The most successful were not those that merely protested against existing systems, but those that simultaneously built counterstructures, incorporating alternative values. From the cooperative movement that emerged in response to predatory industrialization to contemporary free software systems that challenge digital monopolies, the most effective resistance involves the proactive creation of alternative systems that concretely demonstrate the viability of social arrangements based on non-belligerent principles. This constructive approach avoids the common trap of movements that define themselves exclusively by their opposition, eventually becoming dependent on the continuity of what they are fighting to maintain their own identity and cohesion. The historical lesson is clear. Purely reactive resistance inevitably reproduces aspects of what it seeks to transform, while proactive creation of alternatives genuinely transcends old paradigms. The Hermetic tradition offers a final and particularly profound observation on how to effectively resist Belialian influence, by recognizing its fundamental ultimate unreality. The Corpus Hermeticum teaches that entities like Belial, while appearing immensely powerful from certain perspectives, lack independent existence. They are temporary manifestations of imbalances in wider cosmic currents, not fundamental realities in themselves. This understanding does not minimize their immediate influence, but provides a crucial perspective. Seen from the highest perspective, such forces are already contained within a greater order that will eventually reintegrate them. This view avoids both the naive optimism that denies the reality of destructive influences and the paralyzing pessimism that sees them as invincible absolutes. As the Hermetic Book of Divine Wisdom expresses it, he who knows the temporary nature of the shadows neither fears them excessively nor ignores them recklessly, but works patiently with the certainty that the light already contains within itself the resolution of all darkness. The battle against Belialian influence is ultimately not between external light and darkness, but a continuous work of inner alchemy and social transformation, a process of recognition, integration, and transmutation that each individual and community must undertake for themselves, guided by perennial wisdom but adapted to the specific needs of our time. By consciously cultivating values of reciprocity, transparency, and authentic service, we not only resist the influence of this ancient spirit, but actively participate in the creation of new paradigms where its strategy of division and domination gradually loses power. If you're interested in exploring more about spirituality, I've specially selected for you some videos full of profound insights and fascinating discoveries that you'll love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step towards transforming your reality.